14-year-old Elias Carter had waited at the train station every afternoon for 6 years, ever since his father vanished into the mountains. And though every soul in Ash Hollow believed the boy was waiting for someone who would never return, he still carried the same small wooden box to the same weathered bench beside the tracks each day, even through snowstorms and bitter winds, because the last promise his father ever made was that one winter morning someone would step off a train carrying the answer that would change not only his life, but the future of an entire forgotten town. Most people called it foolishness. Others called it grief. But none of them knew the secret hidden inside the little wooden box resting quietly upon his lap. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Elias Carter. If you're watching from a place where hope has ever felt far away, tell us where you're listening from in the comments. The town of Ash Hollow rested high among Colorado's mountains, where the railroad curved through forests of ponderosa pine before disappearing into granite passes dusted with snow for nearly half the year. Steam whistles echoed between the peaks, long before the locomotives themselves appeared, and every arrival brought news from distant cities most folks would never see. Travelers came carrying trunks filled with dreams, merchants unloaded crates of supplies that kept the frontier alive, and letters traveled farther than most people ever would. In a place like Ash Hollow, the railroad was more than steel laid across the earth. It was the thread that stitched together countless lives. Elias Carter had been born beside those tracks during the spring of 1882, when wildflowers covered the valley floor, and meltwater rushed through Alder Creek with such strength that its music could be heard from every porch in town. His mother, Sarah Carter, often laughed at the first sound her son recognized was not birdsong, but the whistle of the morning locomotive climbing through the canyon. She believed children remembered the sounds that welcomed them into the world, and perhaps she was right, for trains became woven into Elias's heart long before he understood where they came from or where they went. His father, Thomas Carter, worked for the railroad as both carpenter and maintenance foreman. There seemed to be little Thomas could not repair. Bridges weakened by spring floods stood firm again beneath his careful hands. Platforms damaged by harsh winters looked stronger after he finished with them than when they had first been built. Even old rocking chairs abandoned on porches somehow found new life after an evening in his workshop. But Thomas believed the finest things a man could ever build were not made of timber. They're made of character, he often told his son as they walked home together after work. Wood rots, iron rusts, goodness lasts longer than both. Every Saturday morning, father and son wandered the railway together before the first passenger train arrived. Thomas inspected rails while Elias searched for smooth stones, feathers, and forgotten treasures left behind by travelers. He discovered brass buttons, old marbles, foreign coins, broken pocket watches, and once even a silver thimble that its grateful owner later claimed with tears of relief. "You've sharp eyes," Thomas said proudly. "I just keep looking. Most people stop looking once they think they know what they'll find." That lesson remained with Elias long after childhood. Sarah Carter taught him different things. She taught kindness. Whenever strangers passed through Ash Hollow with nowhere to sleep, Sarah somehow found an extra blanket. Whenever a widow needed firewood, Thomas quietly chopped enough for the season, while Sarah prepared supper for the family. Their little home possessed few luxuries, yet it somehow always held enough for one more guest. "Hospitality," Sarah whispered one evening while placing another bowl upon the table, "is how lonely people discover they aren't forgotten." Young Elias watched carefully. Children learn far more from what adults quietly do than from what they loudly say. The Carter home welcomed traveling preachers, railroad workers, school teachers, immigrants seeking new beginnings, soldiers returning home, and families searching for land beyond the mountains. Every visitor carried different stories, and Elias listened with wide gray eyes while pretending to carve little wooden animals beside the fireplace. One old trapper described northern lights dancing across frozen skies. A violinist spoke of grand concert halls back east. A weary nurse told stories of frontier babies delivered beneath lantern light. Each tale enlarged the little boy's world. Thomas noticed. "Books teach many things," he said, "but people teach what books cannot." When Elias turned 9, Thomas presented him with a small wooden box he had carved from walnut, harvested years earlier. Its hinges were brass. Its lid carried only one carving, a tiny steam locomotive climbing a mountain pass. "It's yours. What do I keep inside? Whatever matters most." The box soon filled with tiny reminders of ordinary days. His first railroad ticket. A pressed wildflower Sarah helped preserve. The silver thimble, a marble. His mother's favorite recipe, written in careful handwriting. Nothing expensive, everything priceless. Thomas smiled whenever he saw the collection growing. "Good. What? You've learned that value isn't measured by cost." Ash Hollow itself lived by that lesson. Few people grew wealthy in the mountains. Most simply helped one another survive. During brutal winters, every household contributed something. One family baked bread. Another shared blankets. The blacksmith repaired broken sled runners without charge. Pastor William Avery visited isolated cabins carrying medicine and scripture together, believing neither should travel alone. Even the station master, Mr. Edwin Brooks, quietly allowed travelers unable to afford lodging to sleep beside the waiting room stove until morning. The town possessed little, yet somehow lacked almost nothing. Then came the winter of 1890. Snow arrived weeks earlier than expected. Rail lines closed repeatedly beneath avalanches. Mail deliveries became uncertain. Food shipments slowed. Still, Thomas remained cheerful. The mountains always remind us who's really in charge. Late one December evening, another storm rolled through the canyon. The railroad received word that several sections of track required emergency inspection before the morning passenger train could safely pass. Thomas volunteered immediately. Sarah worried. "You've worked since sunrise." "So have the rails. They can wait. The passengers cannot." Elias quietly wrapped his father's scarf around his neck before Thomas stepped outside. "Will you be back for breakfast?" Thomas smiled. "I wouldn't miss your mother's biscuits." He knelt beside his son. "If something ever delays me, it won't." Thomas gently placed both hands upon the little wooden box resting on the table. "Listen carefully." Elias nodded. "There may come a day when I cannot return as quickly as I hoped." The boy frowned. "I don't like talking about that." "Neither do I." Thomas looked toward Sarah before continuing. "But promises matter most when keeping them becomes difficult." He reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded envelope sealed with dark blue wax. "This does not leave our family." Sarah accepted it carefully. "If ever someone arrives carrying the companion journal to this letter, you'll know my promise has reached home." Elias looked confused. "What journal?" Thomas smiled gently. "You'll understand when you're older." Then he looked directly into his son's eyes. "If I cannot return, you will. Someone else will come in my place." Those words lingered strangely in the room. Sarah forced a smile. "You'll frighten him." Thomas laughed softly. "I'm only teaching him patience." He hugged both of them tightly before stepping into the swirling snow. The door closed. The wind swallowed his footsteps. Morning came. Thomas did not. By afternoon, anxious whispers spread through Ash Hollow. A freight crew returning from the eastern pass reported finding evidence of a massive avalanche near Eagle Ridge. Search parties assembled before sunset. Men carrying lanterns, ropes, and shovels disappeared into the mountains. Women gathered inside the church praying quietly, while soup simmered upon iron stoves. Children sensed something terrible had happened, though few understood exactly what. Young Elias refused to leave the station platform. Every whistle echoing through the valley made him lift his head hopefully. Each train arrived. Passengers stepped down. Conductors greeted waiting families. Yet Thomas Carter never appeared. Searches continued for weeks, then months. Spring finally melted the snow enough to reveal shattered timber, twisted rails, and scattered equipment buried beneath rock and ice. Several workers had survived. Others had not. Thomas Carter was never found. No body, no grave, only silence. Many believed the mountain had claimed him forever. Sarah never accepted that explanation. Neither did Elias. Each afternoon he walked to the station carrying his little walnut box. He waited until the last train departed, then quietly returned home beside his mother. 1 week became 1 month. 1 month became 1 year. People spoke kindly at first. He needs time. The poor child still hopes. Eventually, he'll understand. But Elias remembered every word his father had spoken. If I cannot return, someone else will come in my place. Promises mattered, even impossible ones. And though the rest of Ash Hollow slowly surrendered to certainty, a quiet boy sitting upon an old wooden bench beside forgotten railroad tracks never did. The years moved across Ash Hollow the way snow drifted over forgotten fence posts, slowly enough that no one noticed the change until an entire season had disappeared. Each spring softened the frozen hillsides with wildflowers. Each summer filled the valleys with the scent of pine and fresh-cut timber. Each autumn painted the aspens gold, and every winter wrapped the railroad once more beneath deep blankets of snow. Through every season, one sight remained unchanged. Every afternoon, long before the whistle echoed through the canyon, Elias Carter arrived at the station, carrying his small walnut box. He never hurried. He simply appeared, as faithful as the setting sun. At first, the station workers smiled kindly when they saw him. Maybe today, one conductor would say gently, while stepping down from the locomotive. Elias simply nodded. Maybe. Passengers occasionally asked who the quiet boy was. The station master would answer softly, "He's waiting for someone." Family? So he believes. No one corrected the child. Not yet. Mrs. Nora Whitcomb noticed him more than anyone else. Widowed before her own children were grown, she had accepted the modest position of caring for Ash Hollow's small depot after her husband's passing. She swept the waiting room each morning, polished the ticket counter until the oak gleamed, filled the iron stove before sunrise, and knew nearly every traveler by name. She also knew loneliness when she saw it. One chilly afternoon, she carried a steaming bowl of beef stew onto the platform. "You'll catch your death sitting out here." "I'm all right." She set the bowl beside him anyway. "I wasn't asking." Elias looked toward the tracks. "I don't want to miss the train. You'll hear it before you see it." He smiled faintly. "I like watching the smoke appear first." Mrs. Whitcomb followed his gaze toward the distant mountains. So did my husband. From that day forward, she always left something warm for him whenever the weather turned cold. Sometimes soup. Sometimes fresh bread. Sometimes only hot cider. She never called it charity. She simply placed it beside him and continued with her work. Elias always thanked her. Never once did he ask for more. The townspeople slowly settled into believing the boy would eventually outgrow his daily ritual. Children often cling to impossible hopes longer than adults expect. Surely, they thought, time would heal him. But hope did not loosen its grip. It quietly rooted itself even deeper. By the time Elias reached 11 years old, new families had moved into Ash Hollow who knew nothing of Thomas Carter. To them, Elias became simply the station boy. Some viewed him with sympathy, others with curiosity, a few with quiet amusement. Among them was Horace Dunn, owner of the largest mercantile in town. Practical by nature, Horace believed life rewarded those who accepted reality. One afternoon, he stopped outside the station. "Still waiting?" "Yes, sir. It's been years." "I know. You should spend your afternoons learning a trade instead." Elias looked thoughtfully toward the tracks. "I already am." Horace frowned. "What trade?" "Patience." Several bystanders chuckled. Horace shook his head. "Patience doesn't fill empty stomachs." "No. What does?" "Keeping promises." Horace walked away muttering something about stubborn children. Mrs. Whitcomb heard every word. That evening, she quietly added an extra loaf of bread to the basket she sent home with Elias. Some people nourish the body. Others quietly protect the heart. Sarah Carter's health began failing not long afterward. Years of grief settled heavily upon her shoulders. She never complained. She continued sewing clothes for neighboring families, mending coats, baking pies for church socials, and tending her tiny garden behind the cottage. But winter coughs lingered longer each year. Her hands trembled while threading needles. Simple chores exhausted her. Elias noticed long before she admitted anything. You should rest. I will. You always say that. She smiled softly. Mothers usually do. He began rising earlier each morning. Before school, he chopped firewood, fetched water, prepared oatmeal, fed the chickens. After classes, he hurried to the station. Then home again before sunset. The little cottage remained tidy, because Elias quietly shouldered every responsibility he could. One snowy evening, Sarah found him repairing a loose kitchen chair exactly as Thomas once would have. You hold your hammer like your father. He smiled. He showed me. You remember? I remember everything. Sarah looked toward the window where snowflakes drifted gently through fading light. So do I. She walked slowly to the cupboard and removed the blue wax envelope Thomas had entrusted to her years earlier. The seal remained untouched. She held it carefully. I've often wondered whether I should open this. But Father said not to. I know. Then we shouldn't. Sarah nodded. You're right. She returned it to its hiding place. Some promises survive because people refuse to take shortcuts. Others disappear the first time curiosity outweighs trust. The Carters chose trust. Spring returned once again. Then autumn. When Elias reached 13, illness finally overcame Sarah Carter. The entire town gathered quietly around the little cottage during her final days. Mrs. Whitcomb remained beside her bed almost constantly. Pastor Avery prayed softly. Neighbors brought food no one expected to be eaten. Sarah called Elias close. My brave boy. I'm here. She brushed his hair gently away from his forehead. You've waited a long time. I'll keep waiting. I know. Tears gathered in her tired eyes. Never wait because you're afraid to let go. I don't. Why then? He answered without hesitation. Because Father asked me to. Sarah smiled through tears. Then promise me something. Anything. If the day finally comes. It will. Listen carefully before you decide what to do. I promise. She squeezed his hand weakly. The answer may not look the way you've imagined. Those became the last words she ever spoke. Ash Hollow buried Sarah Carter beneath an old pine, overlooking the valley she had loved. The little cottage suddenly felt impossibly quiet. Silence settled into every room. Even the clock seemed to tick more softly. Elias remained there alone. Some neighbors suggested sending him east to distant relatives. Others proposed finding work for him on nearby ranches. Mrs. Whitcomb refused. He belongs here. But he's only 13. He has more courage than many grown men. Pastor Avery agreed. The church quietly arranged for Elias to remain in the cottage. Neighbors rotated chores until he learned to manage everything himself. No one considered him a burden. Ash Hollow remembered what Thomas and Sarah had once done for others. Now the town repaid that kindness. Except one thing never changed. Every afternoon, Elias still walked to the station. The walnut box remained tucked beneath one arm. He sat upon the same weathered bench, watched every train arrive, watched every passenger depart, then walked home beneath the evening stars. Some afternoons, no trains came at all. Heavy snow occasionally closed the line for days. Still Elias arrived. Waiting, he believed, was not dependent upon schedules. One afternoon, retired railroad engineer Silas Boone finally joined him. Silas had spent 40 years guiding steam locomotives through mountain passes before age forced retirement. His face carried deep lines carved by smoke, wind, and countless winters. He lowered himself carefully onto the bench. You know something? What? I was driving engines before your father could shave. Elias smiled politely. So they tell me. Silas chuckled. I've seen every kind of traveler imaginable. I believe it. Happy ones. Angry ones. I'm sure. Runaways. Really? Preachers. Soldiers. Bank robbers. Elias turned toward him. Bank robbers? They usually looked nervous. The boy laughed. Silas smiled. I've also learned something. What? The people worth waiting for almost always arrive later than expected. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Silas asked quietly, "What exactly are you expecting?" Elias rested one hand upon the walnut box. "My father said someone would come carrying the answer. You believe him?" "I do." Silas nodded slowly. "So would I." Elias looked surprised. "You don't think I'm foolish?" The old engineer gazed toward the rails, stretching endlessly through the valley. "I knew your father. So, he wasn't a man who wasted words." Silence settled once more. Before leaving, Silas reached inside his coat pocket. He withdrew an old brass railroad watch. The silver chain had long since disappeared. The crystal bore scratches from decades of service. This stopped working years ago. He handed it to Elias. "I can't take this." "You can." "Why?" "Because your father once repaired it without asking for a penny." Elias accepted it carefully. The hands remained frozen at precisely 7:18. "It doesn't work." Silas smiled. "Not yet." The words lingered strangely. "Not yet." Those same words echoed inside Elias long after the old engineer disappeared down Main Street. Autumn slowly surrendered to winter once again. Snow arrived earlier than anyone expected. The station roof groaned beneath fresh drifts. Icicles stretched from the eaves like crystal spears. Steam locomotives struggled through mountain grades buried beneath fresh powder. Travel became uncertain. Then one evening an exhausted messenger arrived from Denver, carrying difficult news. An avalanche had buried the eastern rail line beyond Granite Pass. Repairs would likely require months, perhaps longer. Passenger service into Ash Hollow would become rare until spring. The townspeople accepted the inconvenience. Merchants stocked extra flour. Families stored firewood. Life adjusted as frontier life always did. Only Mrs. Whitcomb glanced quietly toward Elias sitting upon his familiar bench. No trains, no passengers, nothing but snow and silence. She wondered whether this would finally break the boy's heart. Instead, the very next afternoon, Elias appeared exactly as always. He brushed snow from the empty bench, placed his walnut box upon his lap, and waited beside tracks that disappeared into a white wilderness where no train could possibly come. Far away beyond the mountains, unseen beneath thousands of tons of snow and ice, something long forgotten had finally begun to move. Neither Elias nor anyone else in Ash Hollow could yet imagine that the promise Thomas Carter had spoken 6 years earlier was, at last, slowly making its way home. Winter settled over Ash Hollow with a quiet determination that only the Rocky Mountains seemed capable of producing. Snow covered rooftops until chimneys appeared to rise directly from white hills, pine branches bowed beneath thick blankets of ice, and the railroad tracks disappeared beneath frozen drifts, so deep that even the oldest townsfolk admitted they had never seen a season quite like it. For nearly 3 months, no passenger train reached the station. The waiting room remained unusually silent. The iron stove burned faithfully each morning, yet few travelers gathered around it. Dust collected upon the ticket counter. Telegraph messages became infrequent. The great clock above the platform continued marking each passing hour, though it seemed almost embarrassed to do so. Still, every afternoon, Elias Carter arrived carrying the little walnut box. He brushed fresh snow from the old bench, sat facing the silent rails, and waited. The people of Ash Hollow watched him from windows without saying much anymore. Years earlier they had tried comforting him. Later they had tried persuading him. Eventually they had simply accepted that some hopes belonged to the person carrying them and could not be borrowed or taken away. Mrs. Whitcomb continued leaving warm soup on the bench whenever the weather became especially cruel. Sometimes she lingered nearby. "You know," she said one afternoon, while watching snowflakes swirl through the empty station yard, "most people think waiting is something you do because nothing else can be done." Elias smiled gently. "I don't." "What do you think it is?" "A kind of work." She looked thoughtfully at him. "How so?" "You have to choose it every day." The old widow nodded slowly. "I've never heard anyone describe it that way." "My father would have." Mrs. Whitcomb smiled, though tears quietly gathered in her eyes. "So he would." Far beyond Ash Hollow, crews battled the mountains with shovels, blasting powder, and determination. Newspapers occasionally reached town weeks late, carrying brief reports of collapsed trestles, buried locomotives, and rescue teams struggling through impossible conditions. Few bothered reading beyond the headlines, except Silas Boone. Every edition found its way into his weathered hands before sunset. One evening he appeared at Elias's cottage carrying several folded newspapers beneath his arm. "I've found something curious." Elias invited him inside. The little cottage looked much the same as it had years earlier. Sarah's rocking chair still rested beside the fireplace. Thomas's woodworking bench remained tucked against one wall. Everything had been carefully preserved. Silas unfolded the newspapers upon the table. "Read this." Elias leaned closer. The article described workers clearing snow near Granite Pass. Nothing unusual. Then one sentence caught his eye. "A leather satchel recovered from beneath avalanche debris, believed to have originated from an earlier railway accident." His heart quickened. "A satchel?" Silas nodded. "It may be nothing." "It may, but it may not." Elias stared silently at the words. His father had always carried a leather satchel. "So many railroad men carried them," Silas cautioned. "I know." The old engineer placed one rough hand upon the boy's shoulder. "Hope deserves honesty. I understand. And disappointment comes easier when hope outruns truth." Elias folded the newspaper carefully. "I'll wait." Silas smiled. "I suspected you would." Several more weeks passed. One bright February morning, the telegraph finally crackled with exciting news. The Eastern Line had reopened. Not fully. Only a single narrow passage had been cleared. Passenger service would resume within days. The entire town seemed lighter. Children raced through snow-covered streets pretending to be locomotives. Merchants prepared fresh shipments. The hotel reopened several upstairs rooms closed during the harshest weather. Mrs. Whitcomb polished every station window until sunlight reflected brilliantly from the glass. Ash Hollow felt awake again. When the first train whistle echoed faintly through the valley 3 mornings later, nearly half the town gathered on the platform. Steam billowed between towering pines. The great black locomotive rounded the distant bend slowly, its iron wheels crunching through snow-packed rails. Children cheered. Passengers leaned from windows waving hats. The station suddenly felt alive once more. Elias stood quietly beside his familiar bench. His walnut box rested beneath one arm. The locomotive hissed to a stop. Doors opened. Travelers descended. A businessman, 2 soldiers, a young family carrying sleeping children, 3 miners, an elderly preacher, several merchants. Each greeted waiting relatives before disappearing into town. Finally, the conductor tipped his hat toward Elias. "No one else aboard, son." Elias smiled politely. "Thank you." The train departed. Its whistle faded into the mountains. The platform emptied. Mrs. Whitcomb walked slowly toward him. "I'm sorry." He looked toward the tracks stretching eastward. "So am I." Yet something inside him remained strangely peaceful. The promise had not included the first train, only one winter morning. Winter still remained. Life resumed its familiar rhythm. Each arriving train brought strangers. Each departing train carried others away. None brought the mysterious visitor Thomas had spoken of. Some townspeople quietly wondered whether the avalanche had destroyed whatever message had once been intended. Others believed the promise had never existed outside a father's attempt to comfort his family. Only Elias refused to measure truth by appearances. Late one afternoon, as pale sunlight faded behind the mountains, Pastor Avery stopped beside the station. "I've something for you." He handed Elias a carefully wrapped bundle. Inside rested Thomas Carter's old Bible. "We found it while cleaning the church storage room." Elias traced his fingers across the worn leather cover. "It was Father's. He left it behind after leading a repair crew one autumn." Elias opened it gently. Pressed between 2 pages rested a dried blue mountain flower. His mother's favorite. Nothing else. Or so it seemed. As he turned another page, something slipped quietly onto his lap. A tiny folded piece of paper. Yellow with age. His heart began pounding. The note contained only 7 words written unmistakably in Thomas Carter's careful handwriting. Trust the one carrying the mountain lantern. Nothing more. No explanation. No signature. Pastor Avery looked surprised. I never knew that was there. Neither had Elias. He folded the note carefully. The mountain lantern. What do you suppose it means? I don't know. But the words felt important. Very important. That evening, Elias opened his walnut box. Inside rested every precious thing he had gathered since childhood. The silver thimble, the brass watch Silas had given him, his first railroad ticket, his mother's recipe, a smooth river stone Thomas once admired. Now he carefully added the tiny note, then closed the lid. Outside, snow drifted gently beneath moonlight. Somewhere beyond those mountains walked someone carrying answers. Whether days away or years away, Elias could not know. Meanwhile, another story unfolded many miles east. In the bustling city of Denver, inside a modest boarding house overlooking the rail yard, an elderly woman named Abigail Monroe slowly unpacked belongings she had not touched in over a decade. Her hands trembled with age, not weakness, memory. Among neatly folded clothes rested an old leather satchel scarred by weather, smoke, and time. She laid it carefully upon the bed. For several moments she simply stared. Finally, she unbuckled its worn straps. Inside remained exactly what she had protected through 12 long years. A leather-bound journal, several property deeds tied with faded blue ribbon, a rolled survey map, and one sepia photograph showing Thomas Carter standing proudly beside a steam locomotive, smiling exactly as Elias remembered him. Abigail closed her eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered into the empty room. So terribly sorry. She reached beneath the journal. There rested an envelope addressed in Thomas's handwriting. To my family, if another must carry this home. A single tear slipped quietly down her weathered cheek. She had promised him. She had intended to return within weeks. Instead, an avalanche had changed everything. Broken tracks, illness, years spent caring for an injured husband. Financial hardship. Each season delayed the journey she believed would surely happen the next. Until 12 years had quietly disappeared. Now she was alone. Her husband had passed peacefully the previous autumn. Nothing remained to delay her. She folded Thomas's photograph carefully, placed every document back inside the satchel, then walked to the railway office. I need one ticket. The young clerk smiled. Where to, ma'am? She answered without hesitation. Ash Hollow. The clerk glanced uncertainly at the timetable. That's a long trip through difficult country. I know. You'll arrive after several transfers. That's all right. He printed her ticket. As Abigail accepted it, the clerk noticed her tightly gripping the old leather satchel. Something valuable in there? She smiled faintly. More valuable than anyone realizes. Back in Ash Hollow, dawn arrived beneath another blanket of fresh snow. The station clock struck 8. Steam rose gently from waiting locomotives. Mrs. Whitcomb swept the platform. Silas Boone adjusted his scarf against the cold. Pastor Avery greeted early travelers. Elias took his usual place upon the bench. He noticed something different that morning. The wind. It had changed direction. Instead of blowing down from Eagle Ridge, it carried air from the eastern valley. His father had once smiled whenever that happened. Weather changes before people notice. Elias closed his eyes briefly. For reasons he could not explain, hope suddenly felt less like a memory and more like a visitor quietly approaching. Far beyond the final mountain tunnel, the morning passenger train climbed steadily toward Ash Hollow. Inside the last carriage, Abigail Monroe rested one gloved hand upon the worn leather satchel. The faded photograph of Thomas Carter lay safely inside beside the journal he had entrusted to her 12 years earlier. Outside the window, snow-covered pines flashed past beneath a pale winter sun. The journey Thomas had feared he might never finish was finally entering its last miles. Neither Elias nor the waiting town yet knew that before this winter day ended, the promise carried across 12 years of silence would finally step onto the platform of Ash Hollow Station. The whistle echoed through the mountains just after sunrise, rolling across the snow-covered valley like a familiar hymn that had been absent far too long. People stepped from their homes almost instinctively. Shopkeepers paused while sweeping their porches. Children abandoned snowball fights. Even the horses tied outside the mercantile lifted their heads toward the sound. Another train was arriving. For Elias Carter, it was simply another morning of waiting. He brushed fresh snow from the old wooden bench, placed the walnut box beside him, and watched the distant column of black smoke rise beyond the pine-covered ridge. Mrs. Whitcomb stood near the station door holding a pot of hot coffee for arriving passengers. Silas Boone rested his weathered hands upon his walking stick. Pastor Avery greeted several travelers already waiting on the platform. None of them noticed the elderly woman seated quietly inside the last passenger carriage. Abigail Monroe never looked away from the leather satchel resting upon her knees. Its straps were cracked with age. Its corners had been repaired more than once. It carried no great fortune, yet she guarded it as though the future itself rested inside. Perhaps it did. The locomotive hissed to a stop. Steam drifted around the platform like morning fog. Doors opened. Passengers stepped down one after another. A ranch family carrying blankets. A traveling doctor. 2 salesmen. A school teacher. 1 young soldier returning home. They greeted waiting relatives and disappeared into town. Only 1 passenger remained inside. The conductor climbed aboard. "Ma'am?" Abigail rose carefully. "My stop." He offered his arm. She accepted it. Slowly, almost reverently, she stepped down onto the platform. The moment her boots touched the snow, she stopped walking. Her eyes searched every face. Older, different, yet somehow familiar. Then she saw him, a thin 14-year-old boy sitting quietly upon the same weathered bench Thomas Carter had once described so many years before. The walnut box rested exactly where Thomas had said it would. Her eyes filled with tears. She whispered, almost too softly to hear. "You kept waiting." Elias noticed the stranger looking toward him. He stood politely. "Good morning, ma'am." She nodded, unable to answer immediately. Instead, she slowly reached into her satchel. Every movement seemed deliberate, almost sacred. She withdrew the faded photograph. Thomas Carter smiled back from another lifetime. Elias froze. The photograph slipped from her trembling hands. He caught it before it touched the snow. His breath caught. "My father." Abigail closed her eyes. "Yes." Silence spread across the platform. Mrs. Whitcomb stopped pouring coffee. Silas Boone lowered his hat. Pastor Avery quietly removed his gloves. Even the conductor sensed something extraordinary unfolding. Abigail finally spoke. "My name is Abigail Monroe." Elias looked from the photograph to the worn satchel. "My father knew you. He saved my life." The station became utterly still. She gently placed the leather satchel into Elias's hands. "He asked me to bring this home." His fingers trembled. 12 years. "I know. I thought." "So did I." Tears streamed down her face. "The mountains kept me away far longer than either of us imagined." Mrs. Whitcomb quietly unlocked the station waiting room. "Come inside." No one argued. Within minutes, nearly every respected member of Ash Hollow gathered around the old oak table. The satchel rested at its center. Abigail carefully removed its contents, one piece at a time. First came Thomas Carter's leather journal, then several folded survey maps, property deeds tied neatly with faded blue ribbon, a brass compass engraved with a mountain lantern. Pastor Avery immediately remembered the tiny note hidden inside Thomas's Bible. "Trust the one carrying the mountain lantern." His heart quickened. Finally, Abigail unfolded the sealed envelope. The blue wax remained perfectly intact. Sarah Carter had never opened its companion letter. Neither had Thomas's. Elias looked quietly around the room. "I think," he swallowed, "I think they're meant to be opened together." Pastor Avery nodded. "So do I." With great care, Elias broke the seal. The room remained silent. except for the crackle of the stove. Thomas Carter's familiar handwriting filled the page. My beloved Sarah and my dear Elias, if these words have reached you by another's hands, then the Lord chose a different road for me than the one I hope to walk beside you. Do not spend your lives searching for where I ended. Instead, finish what I began. Years ago, several ranchers quietly placed land into trust so orphan children crossing these mountains would always have a safe place to learn, eat, and sleep. Many feared wealthy investors would seize it. The journal and deeds carried by Abigail prove that the land belongs to the people of Ash Hollow forever. One day, children with nowhere else to go will need it. Promise me they will find open doors instead of locked gates. Elias, if you are reading this, know that I never stopped believing you would keep your word. Your greatest inheritance is not this land. It is the kind heart your mother helped you grow. Carry that farther than any railroad can travel. No one spoke. Even the fire seemed quieter. Silas Boone wiped tears from his weathered face. I'd have followed that man anywhere. Abigail slowly opened the journal. Inside, Thomas had recorded every meeting, every survey, every signature, every agreement protecting nearly 40 acres overlooking Ash Hollow, land that everyone believed belonged to an Eastern Railroad company. It never had. Years earlier, corrupt speculators had quietly attempted to erase the original documents after Thomas disappeared. Without proof, no one challenged them. Now the proof rested upon the table. Judge Edwin Mercer was summoned immediately. He examined every page carefully, every signature, every seal, every map. At last, he removed his spectacles. The trust is valid. He looked around the room. Legally, this land belongs exactly where Thomas intended. News spread through Ash Hollow faster than any train ever could. Families gathered outside the church that evening. Some wept, others laughed. Parents embraced children. Several older residents remembered contributing lumber to the original project decades earlier, before hope had slowly disappeared. Now hope had returned, not because of wealth, because of faithfulness. Construction began the following spring. Men donated timber. Women organized meals. Children carried stones. Even Horace Dunn, the practical merchant who had once mocked Elias for waiting, quietly supplied nails, glass, and paint without charging a single penny. One afternoon he approached Elias while workers raised the final beams. I owe you an apology. You don't. I judged something I didn't understand. Elias smiled gently. My father said most people stop looking once they think they know what they'll find. Horace laughed softly. He was wiser than I ever realized. Months later, the new building stood proudly upon the hillside overlooking the station. Half school, half orphan home. Its windows welcomed morning sunlight. Its doors never remained locked during daylight. Above the entrance rested a simple wooden sign, the Carter House. Not because Thomas had built it, because he had believed in it long before anyone else. Mrs. Whitcomb became its first housekeeper. Pastor Avery organized lessons. Silas Boone taught older boys about railroads, tools, and honesty. Abigail Monroe remained in Ash Hollow, quietly spending her final years reading stories to children beneath the old maple tree beside the school. As for Elias, he no longer waited each afternoon upon the station bench. Instead, he greeted every arriving train. Sometimes frightened children stepped onto the platform alone. Runaways, orphans, families seeking new beginnings. Elias welcomed each one personally. You're safe here. He knew how powerful those words could be. Years passed. Ash Hollow slowly became known across Colorado as a town where no child was ever turned away hungry. Travelers often asked how such generosity had begun. The townspeople simply smiled toward the old station. It started with a promise. On quiet evenings, Elias occasionally carried the walnut box back to the familiar bench. Inside it remained every treasure collected throughout his life. The silver thimble, his mother's recipe, the brass railroad watch, the dried mountain flower, Thomas's note, and now, the faded photograph. Beside it rested the little brass compass, engraved with the mountain lantern. He rarely opened the box. He no longer needed reminders. The promises inside had all been kept. Sometimes children asked why he smiled whenever trains arrived. He answered exactly the same way every time. Because you never know whose journey is finally ending. Many years later, visitors entering Ash Hollow noticed a bronze plaque standing beside the restored station. It read, "Some promises travel slowly, but they still arrive." People often stopped to read it before continuing their journey. Few knew the entire story. Fewer still understood that the plaque honored not only Thomas Carter, but also a quiet boy who refused to surrender hope, simply because time grew long. 14-year-old Elias Carter had waited at the train station every day for someone who never seemed to come. The world had called him foolish. The mountains had tested his patience. The years had tried to wear down his faith. Yet in the end, it was not the passing of trains that defined his life. It was the keeping of a promise. Thank you for walking these forgotten trails with us today. If this story stayed with you, we hope you'll share it with someone who could use a reminder that hope is never wasted. Before you go, tell us in the comments, what promise have you kept, even when it seemed like it might never matter? Until next time, stay close, and remember, here at Hearthstone Trails, forgotten roads still lead home.